Oh, where the fuck's the pop-up? It's supposed to give me a pop-up. Here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Pro Democracy Pod. This is a podcast where we will be talking about democracy movements around the world and the United States' role in them. Basically, our idea was to take a closer look at the kind of the real character of the supposed democracy movements that the United States supports abroad. We've seen groups of protesters in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Bolivia more recently. We see it in Hong Kong last year, in Belarus. And we see that these people who are supported by the United States, I actually was the first journalist to reveal how the National Endowment for Democracy, it's an agency that was it's a supposedly non-governmental agency that was sectioned out of the CIA, was funding the protesters in Hong Kong. There was a coalition of I want to say like 34 protest groups that came together to lead the charge in Hong Kong, and the National Endowment for Democracy was funding them. So these people were going around and they were beating up old people. They were stabbing politicians that they didn't like. They were burning down trade unions, and all these nasty things. But yet the Western media called them pro-democracy protesters. And we see this term over and over again whenever there's like an eruption of a protest movement. They're called pro-democracy protesters, and they're called grassroots and all these other things that they really aren't. So we wanted to take a look at that. This is, obviously something that is going to be continuing under the Biden administration. I think especially under the Biden administration, whereas, Trump was more isolationist. At least in rhetoric, he was more isolationist. But the rhetoric around the pro-democracy protesters, I expect to be heightened. So this is something that Mila and I have both kind of focused on. A lot of other journalists have covered this topic. So we thought it was a good one to have a podcast on, to be the central theme. It's not going to be the only thing we're talking about. We'll also talk about domestic politics in the United States and Canada. Mila is based in Canada. I'm actually based in Mexico, but I live most of my life in the United States. So, Mila, what drew you to this idea?
Yeah, so I don't really do I didn't do a lot of stuff on China or anything like that, but my background's in Middle East politics, and I kind of had a bit of a journey like a lot of people did with the Syria thing, because I grew up frankly like hearing a lot about Syrian politics. My family is from the region. But like no one was a fan of the Assad family because of the occupation of Lebanon, where my family is originally from. So at the beginning of the revolution in 2011, when I saw people like rising up, I thought, oh, okay, well, that sounds great. Like they're rising up against a bad government. But what ended up happening was that the movement wasn't really so great, to put it mildly. It got overrun. There were progressive people that I'm sure that had like great reformist ideas, or that like had very legitimate grievances. And so I'm not someone to totally dismiss any sort of popular protest outright. But what tended to happen, and this is kind of what I did my research on when I was still in the political science land, was that these protests got overrun by Islamic fundamentalists. And I had grown up with stories about Christian persecution in the Middle East. My grandmother grew up in Egypt, and she's a Christian there. They're pretty like small minority. And so obviously I had knee-jerk sympathies to Christians in Syria who started to sort of express hesitance about these so-called rebels. And as I sort of, learn more, I had to, kind of had to deal with the conflicting sort of things going on within me where I was kind of like not a fan of this government, but also um, really like I'm still a political realist in the sense that it's probably not great when there's an army of Islamic fundamentalists that are getting billions of dollars from foreign funding, trying to violently overthrow the government, who have very, frankly, bigoted and genocidal views about Christians, about Shias, and so on. And so, yeah, I guess like all that to say is that what sort of drawn me to this is I think that I used to be broadly part of like what's called the left or progressives and whatever, and I think they tend to kind of see any sort of uprising or protest, like anything with a witty sign, as something romantic and says something good. And I'm obviously strawmanning a little bit because it's not everybody, but I kind of want to push back and say, just because someone has like a democratic aesthetic or like a protest aesthetic, that doesn't mean that the movement itself is worth supporting. And we should be able to have these conversations and challenge these so-called progressive orthodoxies, especially when the movements are people who are not even progressive to begin with. So that's where my background is in the area.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, right? Like, I know, like in Hong Kong, for example, they had these signs that were calling for a return of the Queen, right? For the
Right.
Queen's control over Hong Kong, and yet we call them pro-democracy protesters, even though
Right.
that's obviously not democracy. I mean, it's both colonialism and kind of like a kind of reformed theocracy. Um,
Yeah.
but I think we should probably start off by like introducing ourselves a little bit
Mhm.
for people who might not be familiar.
Mhm.
So I'll go first if you don't mind, Mila.
Go ahead.
All right. So I'm Alex Rubenstein. I started in journalism by basically following around the Black Lives Matter movement in the aftermath of the killing of Eric Gardner. Um, in New York City, and I was based in New York City at the time, so it was really hot at that point. And I'd go and I, film videos and stuff, and eventually I got a job at RT America. So I worked at RT for a few years, 2 years actually, and I moved on to Sputnik, where I became a writer. At RT, I was, doing a lot of web stuff and live streams from protests. I got to cover a lot of really cool stuff. Um, but at Sputnik, I got to get my hands dirty with writing, which I that's my main thing. I'm usually a writer. I don't really. I mean, I go out and I tweet videos live, but I'm usually not facing the camera. So this is a new thing for me. So I hope that you guys bear with me. I also want to give a shout out really quick to my fiance. 30 minutes before this stream, my webcam died. So she went out and got me a new one. It's like super HD. I love it. But going back to my biography, so I worked at Sputnik for about a year, maybe less, and then I moved on to Mint Press News. At Mint Press News, I actually spent 18 days living inside the Venezuelan embassy. There was a group of actual democracy activists who were with Code Pink, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Black Alliance for Peace, and other groups who were defending this embassy from a takeover by the United States government. It's really interesting because on the day that Juan Guaido declared or attempted a military coup, he had like a video camera on himself on a bridge with like 30 or something ridiculous, 30 military defectors. Absolutely not enough to actually overthrow the government, and it totally fizzled out. But on that very same day, a group of what the media would call pro-democracy protesters surrounded the building and placed it under siege. So they wouldn't allow people to come in or out. They wouldn't allow medication, food, anything. So I spent 18 days inside there for Mint Press News. And what I found when I looked into the people who were actually outside and leading this movement is that they were basically elites. They were super racist, super bigoted, very intimidating. I'd wake up to the sound of people calling my name. If you look on my Twitter profile, you can see a sign that they put out because I was, tweeting so much about them and they really didn't like that. They put out a sign saying that they were going to miss my Twitter when the police cut electricity to the building. So this was all in Washington, D.C., but it was like a microcosm of like how the U.S. government uses proxies like abroad. It was a really good metaphor for that because the Secret Service was outside and they were claiming to be impartial, but they weren't. They were favoring the right-wing Venezuelans at every point. And there's a lot of reporting that I've done on that. I don't want to go too far into that, but it was really, like I said, it was a really good example of how they use like private citizens. I wasn't able to prove any funding to them or any logistical training, but these people were very connected to U.S. institutions, and so that's the same thing they do abroad. Is the United States people, the citizens they don't have an appetite for war anymore. I mean, look at Afghanistan right now. The U.S. is finally pulling out after 20 years, and the Taliban is just like taking everything over. So it was totally a useless war that lasted for 20 years. It caused a ton of poverty, excuse me, a ton of loss of life. So the U.S. doesn't have an appetite for that. So they use like foot soldiers, proxy soldiers. That's why on our graphic it doesn't say support the troops. It says support the shock troops, which is basically what these pro-democracy protesters are. I've also contributed to the Gray Zone. It's my favorite publication. Mint Press News and the Gray Zone are like, to me, the two leading outlets. So I'm sure all you guys are really familiar with them.
What about the Daily Beast?
Oh yeah. Well, I'm like one of their favorite like alternative reporters. So they love to talk smack about me. It's really funny. They did a hit piece on me one time, and everything that they quoted me as saying, because I didn't tell them anything bad, it made me sound pretty good. So it was a badge of honor to be smeared by the Daily Beast. And I know a lot of other leading left-wing alternative journalists have been, and I was kind of honored to join their ranks. But now I'm based in Mexico. I write for Substack. I try to focus on investigative reporting. And we're starting this podcast. So welcome to the show. And we really appreciate you guys being here.
Yeah. So I am not a journalist. I don't have any journalistic background. Currently I'm studying law, but before that I was doing political theory. I did my master's thesis on popular protests, so kind of appropriate. And what I looked at was the Arab Spring and basically how protests can be made up of really diverse actors. And, at the beginning, that might be a really good thing because you can build a broad coalition, but they tend to be co-opted very easily, or not even co-opted, but subsumed by whoever has the most material power. So that was kind of my argument. So I feel like this is an appropriate place for me to land in that respect. And I'm certainly not, against protesting. And I think often even in places like, again, I don't really know much about the Hong Kong protests, but I'm sure like there are always people with legitimate grievances. But again, who has the most money who has the most material support, those are going to be the ones that overtake the movement. So that's what my work has been on. And I also write for Passage magazine, mostly stuff on like ideological debates, but also like some anti-war stuff. And I got into anti-war politics very young, probably due to my background. I think the first time I ever got into it I was at a family dinner when I was like 11, and people in my family were talking about how evil George Bush was. And so that was kind of my entry into into this world. And especially now, I think when I look at the U.S. climate, I really do think Biden and his sort of neocon army are like a recreation of Bush, but with like, rainbow stickers or whatever. And so I do think it's like a good time to be having these discussions that have gotten me into, politics in the first place. Now I'm studying law. I am very interested in international law and the ways that it, sort of relates to imperialism. So you might hear some hot takes from me on that front as well. But yeah, I have not done a lot of journalism. I mostly just like mouth off in my writing, but you can find it at Passage.
It's smart writing, though, I have to say. I mean, you're a good writer. And yeah, I would say that you focus on like a lot of left-wing politics, internal debates. I don't think either of us really consider ourselves left-wing, though, right?
Yeah,
I
I feel
mean,
like I did at one point, but
it's funny. I like to talk about this because like left wing, right wing, this is like a term that originated in France in the 1800s based on like where people
yeah,
sat in parliament. So like to put it in today's modern context and have it be like, as you said, such a subsuming, well, you were talking about something else, but have it be such a subsuming idea is frankly ridiculous. I mean, and with so many different factions on the so-called left and so-called right, it really becomes meaningless in my opinion. So I prefer not to use the term left wing.
yeah, same. I really think that it's becoming obsolete because there have been agreements among, and I mean, this is kind of funny because this is what that Daily Beast article was so upset about, was like, they talk about Jimmy Dore trying to find common ground with the right. And it's kind of like, well, that's how you achieve things. Like when Canada got free healthcare, we got it, like it was a multi-party effort, right? And so yeah, I just think that like now if you're using these labels too much, or like the way that they're used now, it's more used to divide people over things that they could actually potentially collaborate on. And so that's why I don't use it for myself anyway.
Yeah. So, actually going back to the like whole pro-democracy podcast theme, I wanted to talk a little bit about a recent investigative series that I did. And Mila, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in at any time. Help me out. But so I actually went to a conference in Washington, D.C. It was a 3-day conference hosted at the Omni Shoreham Hotel. It's very opulent, high-end hotel that traditionally hosts like these kind of, elite conferences, and that's exactly what it was. And the theme, which we've already kind of touched on, is religious freedom, but in the sense that it was like totally legitimate for persecuted Christians in the Middle East, and Lebanon and Syria. This was not that. This was an imperial meeting of minds, and actually there was like a number of high-level U.S. government officials. I encourage you guys all to check this out on my Substack. There was, for one, Mike Pompeo, the Trump's CIA director and then Secretary of State, and then there was Anthony Blinken, the current Secretary of State. Nancy Pelosi was there. Samantha Power, who was the leading champion of humanitarian interventionism in the Obama years in his administration, and is now the director of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. This is much like the National Endowment for Democracy. It's like a cutout of the CIA that basically works to overthrow governments that assert their sovereignty against United States economic interests. So it was really a rogues gallery of like high level people. But I think one of the important things to note is that this, like, they basically, how conferences work is like you become a partner of the conference, and they have tiers of like partner levels, right? and you get to a higher level by giving them more money. So a lot of the partners of this conference were like really shady groups. Like, of course, a lot of them were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, particularly the Uyghur groups, World Uyghur Congress, Uyghur American Association, and the Uyghur Human Rights Project. But alongside them, you also had a lot of these like Christian far right groups, like the Family Research Council. This is like a group that like consistently lobbies against gay rights, and other groups that have like worked towards forcibly sterilizing people, transgender people in Europe, who want to have their like ID reflect their preferred identity. It was a lot of shady characters, and chief among those shady characters were two organizations. One is called, you may be familiar, the Church of Scientology, which is like one of the most abusive cults that like has ever existed. And I write about a lot of their abuses in my article. And then the other one is the Falun Gong cult, and both these cults believe in aliens. It's really funny when you like look at their actual beliefs. Falun Gong says that aliens have influenced people to create computers, and the way that aliens get humans to distance themselves from the gods is by mixing the races. And then the Church of
thought
Science.
that was true.
It could be. I mean, I don't have any evidence against it. So, but I wouldn't assert it with certainty either. And then the Church of Scientology obviously believes that there was an alien dictator named Xenu who sent aliens to Earth, gathered them around volcanoes, and then blew them up with a hydrogen bomb. And then those alien spirits are attaching themselves to humans and creating a lot of our problems. So, like, obviously, these are like far right, anti-communist, abusive cults. I explained how both of them are anti-communist and abusive, and they were sponsors of this of this conference, which the like high level leaders of the United States government went to and spoke to. So why did that happen? It happened because the conference was really like a front for like bashing China. I went to a lot of the panels, and I did a count of how many panels there were, and 1 in 5 of them were focused on China. And it was a regime change fest. It was just like the highest ranking NGO activists, Christian far right organization leaders, all these people getting together to like figure out a way of furnishing this narrative about China that they're violators of religious freedom, and using that to as like a cudgel against the Chinese government. So I really encourage people to look into that article. It exposes actually it's a series of articles, but it exposes like the whole network, and this new talking point, because this was like the first of such conferences. They're going to be held every year. So this is like really just the beginning, and I was lucky enough to be able to go and report extensively on this. I hope that in the coming years, other journalists do the same thing, because this isn't going to stop. The religious freedom issue is going to continue, and it wasn't even all religious freedom. I hate to keep hammering the Hong Kong issue, but one of the speakers on a panel I went to, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce his name right, but I'll give it a go. His name is Baguio Long. And he was a legislator in Hong Kong, and he also he was the spokesman for an organization in Hong Kong at the time of the riots that swept the city for a year, and he was the spokesman for this organization called the Hong Kong National Front. One of their members was arrested with like explosives. And actually, went to prison. And when he was at his bail hearing, Baguio Long, who was a speaker at this conference, sat in. He was a spokesman for his group, very much associated. Now he's a fugitive living in DC, where he started the Hong Kong liberation organization or something like that. It's my article. So now that he's not able to go back to China for fear of being arrested, he's in DC agitating to overthrow the government of China as like kind of somebody with the lived experience to say why why it needs to be overthrown, why we need to continue this hybrid warfare campaign. So actually, we've been having some discussions about recurring segments that we want to do on our podcast, and we want to give out every episode a democracy award. So I would personally nominate Baguio Long for the Democracy Award on today's episode. I don't know. I didn't consult Mila on this, so I apologize. But again, this is, this had like the shadiest cast of characters, this conference. And I was inside and actually, I spoke to an official of the Central Tibetan Administration. And this is like, I might get some heat for this, but if you look into people who have left the Tibetan Buddhist sect, they also describe an abusive cult style organization. If you look at what the Dalai Lama has said, he said that he's capable of imagining what's going to happen in the future. He says he's going to live to be 113 years old. This is a cult leader that actually received more than $1 million per year from the CIA in the 1960s. And since then, since the National Endowment for Democracy was created, they pumped tons of money into these Tibetan groups, who, by the way, have been heavily supported, given political backing from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So they use this progressive language to promote like it's not even regime change in this case, it's balkanization. They want autonomy, a new state, East Turkestan for Xinjiang. They want freedom for Tibet. They want the same thing in Hong Kong. And I've even seen there's a province called Lower Mongolia that they're trying to separate and cut out from China. So I actually talked to an official of the Tibetan Central Administration. It's another fake government like the East Turkestan supposed government. And I asked him, there's been a lot of people in Congress that have been pushing for a U.S. consulate in Tibet. And I asked him, how does that benefit the Tibetan people? And basically what he admitted to me was that the U.S. government would use it to spy on China. He said the State Department's not able to get accurate information out of there. So they would use that to keep tabs on things. This is what he was just totally, he just admitted it outright. Another person I talked to was, it was really funny. I was actually at a lunch. The lunch was called Sanctioned by China. High-level U.S. government officials speak out or something like that. And it had Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley, the senators who are two of the most rabidly imperialist far-right senators in the Senate. And while I was waiting for the program to start, I sat down and I was sitting next to these two NGO activists, and I was trying to listen to their conversation. And one of their groups is banned from China. The other one wasn't. So they were talking about ways that they can work together. I actually don't know which groups they belong to. I wasn't able to learn that. One of them said to the other, yeah, the anti-imperialist left thinks we're a CIA front. I'm just thinking I wonder why that is. I'm trying to listen closer. And then this girl sits next to me. She asked if she can sit next to me. I, of course, say yes. And we start talking. She tells me that she's a journalist with Billy Graham's Evangelical Association, their magazine. So we're talking, and I'm making up a fake story about why I'm interested in the China issue. And I looked like a total hippie while I was there. It was hilarious. Everyone was in suits and religious garb or military uniforms. I'm sitting there with this shirt and a pair of jeans and my long ass hair that desperately needs to be cut. So I don't, I stuck out like a sore thumb. But what this girl winds up admitting to me is that even though Billy Graham's Evangelical Association is banned in China, they're doing covert illegal missionary work there. So this is just like a glimpse of how the religious freedom issue is going to be used to agitate against enemy states of the U.S. government. So I really encourage people to look that over. I'm really proud of that work. But I will stop talking about myself now. And
No, um, no, I think it is really funny that they did make that about religious freedom because I mean I hate to bring it back to the Syria issue, but like I said, I don't like I'm not huge on following China, but the one thing that I do know and like what actually got me to kind of learn a little bit more about the Uyghur issue was the fact that there were I don't know the exact number, but there was this not an insignificant number that went to Syria and
yeah,
fought with these jihadist groups. And like, I think that, I've been feeling really annoyed that people are making this about religious, like when I was reading about, oh, okay, they're making this about religious freedom because they don't care about the religious freedom of Syrian minorities. Like if you're looking at what these groups are doing, these groups are making it so that, if you are a Christian, you either have to convert or they'll kill you.
yeah,
And it's kind of funny to see evangelicals get behind that, because they kind of used to put up this sort of front about like caring about Middle East Christians. They had that period where they would change their profile picture to like the noon, which is like the letter for Nazarene, which ISIS used to put on the Christians' doors. And so now there's not really a strong regard for that. And like, I mean, I'm not a carceral person. I don't think that like, you should lock up people if they didn't do anything wrong. But I do like I have the sort of, I guess, radical view that if you go and join ISIS, you should, go to
face
prison.
consequences. Yeah,
But I mean, what I kind of like that was kind of my issue with it, and like I saw the Canadian government jump on this as well, and like Aaron O'Toole was like starting to, being all into this whole weird human rights thing, and I was thinking to myself, like, in Canada we had one guy who was underage that got sent to Guantanamo. We let the U.S. take him to Guantanamo, violated his charter rights, and he allegedly threw one grenade in Afghanistan. Who knows if he did or not? But like, I mean, either way, like, let's assume that he did, and that's bad and whatever. So Canada had to pay him a settlement because they violated his charter rights. And Aaron O'Toole, who's the candidate for a Conservative Party, has a statement about how it was so awful that Canada paid him a settlement because he was a terrorist and blah 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 blah. And which I agree, it's not an appealing thing to do. But first of all, when you violate charter rights, that tends to happen. But what's funny to me is, he's upset that there's like one guy who got out of prison and Canada has to apologize to. And I'm thinking, what if you had 5,000 of those and they went off to Syria
yeah.
and they went to terrorize Christians? And so I have a piece about this on my Substack as well. But I was saying, like, how would he respond in that scenario if they were Canadians?
Right.
And like I said, I thought the war on terror was terrible, and I don't think anyone who did nothing wrong should should pay any price. But yeah, if you're gonna go and commit terrorism, like I just think that there's kind of a double standard where we kind of see, the countries we don't like are under this like hugely like liberal scrutiny, and then but then with us, it's like no, like we're what are you talking about? Of
Well,
course
we're
it's
doing our
a
best.
Guantanamo. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and you look at Xinjiang, and like, there's been you said the war on terror is terrible, but so is like terror, right? And you look at
Yeah.
Xinjiang, and they've suffered from mass casualty suicide bombings and that kind of thing over the year. So the government's like taking these steps to like try to de-radicalize people and teach them skills that can make them productive members of society. The U.S. government calls that a concentration camp, which as like a Jewish person, that's pretty offensive to me. Um,
Right. Yeah.
then you talk about Guantanamo, and it's like, look, one of the leading groups that's taken up the Uyghur issue. It's called the Campaign for Uyghurs. This is founded by Rushan Abbas, who actually spoke at the conference. She spoke on a panel that I went to about boycotting the Beijing Olympics in 2022. And this woman worked for 7 years in Guantanamo Bay. Where was she?
Wow.
Where was she
Yeah.
then? She was working in Guantanamo Bay. She wasn't, advocating for human rights in the United States or in Cuba because it's illegally occupied. She was working there. So I mean, the conference just, because it's like these really shady characters that have no regard for human rights, demonstrably so, that are like advocating for human rights in China. It's exactly as you said. They're quick to point fingers, but never want to look at themselves. And this is actually, a good way to transition into your last article for
Yeah.
Read Passage, because that's exactly what your piece was about. How the Canadian government is kind of using the issue of human rights in Cuba to distract from their own issues. I mean, here in the United States, we have a lot of people that are going to be homeless soon. Really quick before we talk about your piece, Cuba was another country that was brought up as a violator of religious freedom at this conference. So it's not just China. This is an issue which is going to be used across the board, because Republicans, Democrats, nobody's going to say, "Oh yeah, we're against religious freedom." So it's an issue that gives perfect cover for their imperial agenda. But I'll pass to you to talk about your last piece.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what I was saying about, the Uyghur thing too, kind of connects to that as well, because like I am not interested in necessarily litigating, like whether or not these countries are good. Like I think that's a
Yeah.
very utopian and like not a very helpful thing, because at the end of the day there's nothing I can do to influence like Chinese government policy. Like I think it is kind of sucks that a Canadian's getting death penalty because I don't believe in death penalty. But like again, like I'm very concerned to see that this is the first time that some people care about the death penalty.
Yeah.
But
well, it's billionaires,
yeah, and I mean, again, like I like just maybe this is like my recent like law background. I personally don't agree with the death penalty, but like it's not my fight, right? It's not my country. And like I'm concerned with what my country's doing. And like, yes, we do not have the death penalty. That's great, but we do have a very troubling carceral system. I just took a class on evidence, and like it was crazy to me to see the way like what people use to justify people getting locked up in Canada. And it's like, I'm not even like a radical prison abolitionist or anything like that, but I just was very I was shocked to see that people who talk about these human rights abuses abroad don't really say the same about our own country. So that's kind of what I started talking about in the article. And it was inspired by, I was actually driving in downtown Vancouver, where like I live in Vancouver. And I'm just like driving, and there was so first, like I was driving to North Van, and on the way there I see Falun Gong protest. And I'm like, okay, well, whatever. Like, I guess this happens. There's a Falun Gong protest. That's annoying, but whatever. And then on my way home, I see a Cuba protest. And like, granted, it was a very pathetic protest. There was probably 8 people, but they were really rowdy. And there were a lot of people cheering them on, like driving by and honking. And it was like honk for Cuba, SOS Cuba, whatever. And I think like something about it hit me the wrong way, probably because I was in downtown Vancouver. So a lot of people don't know this, but downtown Vancouver has like one of the biggest drug problems in North America, problems with drug addiction and homelessness. Often those two are intertwined, and it's very cruel the way that addicts are treated here. We had a long, hard fought battle for like a safe injection site in Vancouver, which is, making progress. But, long story short, there are a lot of people who are like really suffering. And like, it just kind of struck me as like the peak of like liberal, like protest aesthetic stuff. Like, there's like people sleeping in doorways like a block away from you. it's people overdosing probably a few blocks away from you, and you're like jumping up and down and screaming about a foreign country. So that's like what kind of inspired the piece. I tweeted about it a little bit at first, and my editor at Passage messaged me and asked me to write about it. And like some people got mad at me because they were like, this is just like whataboutism, or like you can care about more than two things at once, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, I guess like, you know, the protest thing, fine, but like it's a bit tasteless to be doing this over here. And then second of all, like I think the bigger issue is that, you know, as Canadians, we have somewhat of a say in what our government can do, right? Like this is the whole premise of a democratic citizenry. We don't have a say in what Cuba can do. And further, and this is kind of the point I was making in the article, the one thing that we could do to help Cuba is pressure our ally, who probably still won't listen to us, but it's the one thing we could do. Pressure our ally, the US, to lift the blockade, which is, you know, shown. Even people who are not communists can acknowledge that you know, the blockade has been economically devastating. It was admitted as such by a lot of the architects of the sanctions on Cuba. And so it's not like a secret that this is something that is quite devastating. We know that sanctions do this, you know, even like when it's not Cuba, you know, I have friends, there's a lot of Iranians in my community here. And like, you know, one of my friends who's like not political, definitely not a leftist, not a commie or whatever, was telling me like, I really wish they would lift the sanctions on Iran because, you know, my family can't access the medicine that it needs, that they need to survive. You know, it's been really difficult for us, especially during COVID. And so my point being is like, you know, these are ways that we can alleviate suffering. And it doesn't even have to be a partisan thing, you know, like this is just a way to make people's lives less difficult. And instead of, you know, agitating for doing the one thing that could help people in Cuba, what our Canadian media has been doing. And so for people who don't know, like the Canadian media is very, again, I don't even like using left and right because these are like not real terms anymore, but it's very like, it's kind of neocon. Like I feel like we're about like 10 years behind the United States. So it's like, you know, if we have an MP that's like, we should be diplomatic with China instead of like want to bomb them, then like people will write articles like this MP loves dictators, blah, blah, blah. Like it's a very silly media landscape. It's very uncharitable. And so that's kind of what happened is like people were mad because Canada is not the same as the US. We actually do have some diplomatic relations with Cuba. Our prime minister is actually Castro's son, so
That's funny.
But there's a sort of, you know, we actually have some diplomatic relations. And, you know, people were condemning our prime minister for not being more like the US when it comes to Cuba. And so I just kind of noticed this sort of elite dissonance because you're kind of, you know, not only are you avoiding doing something that can help Cubans, but you're condemning our government for not hating Cuba enough, for doing stuff that we actually do to our own citizens. Like the accusations they're making against Cuba are things that we're doing to our own citizens. And I was like, you know, like we have a higher homelessness rate in Vancouver than the entire country of Cuba.
Of course. Yeah.
Like, why is that not a cause for concern? You know, in school here is like less affordable than it is over there. Like higher education, it's not as bad as it is in the US, but like no one here pays $50,000 a year for school, which is insane. I feel really bad for you guys. But still, you know, it's like we have a lot of problems. And I think, you know, this is something that the populist left and the populist right are kind of coming together on. And it's like heartening to see, but they're coming together and noticing that like our political elites are, you know, pointing the finger at other countries to, you know, ignore the suffering of their own people. So they're not for the people, like they're not representing us. They are representing a class of people worldwide. Our our prime minister, our media has more allegiance to US elites than it has to Canadians.
Yeah.
And I think, like I said, like populist left and populist right, they're both real, like they both converge on this, and it's something that I really believe in further provoking. And so I wrote this article to just be, and like even the other day, you know, I saw O'Toole talking about the Beijing Olympics, and I remembered again, we had the Olympics here in Vancouver a few years ago. We are still, like right now, we are under hot water because we're discovering dead bodies of children who were like malnourished to death, like neglected to death through like a systematic cultural genocide. And so it's kind of like you're really talking about Beijing
Yeah.
right in the middle of this, and it's a, you know, it's because he has no allegiance to the people who are impacted by these things. These people have no allegiance to Canadians in general, not just Indigenous Canadians, but to Canadians struggling with housing insecurity, to Canadians struggling with addiction. They have no allegiance to them at all. They're running purely to, you know, enhance their status as members of this elite. And so I think that's important to talk about and converge on.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And, you know, just to circle back really quick to what you were saying about the populist right, I'll give them a lot of credit. They were very good on Russia.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I don't see that same those
Yeah, they're
same
bad on
sentiments
China.
put to China. Yeah, but you know, I do want to say really quick that like this, you know, I'm not an ideologue, right? I'm not like defending China or pushing back against the Chinese anti-China
Mhm.
propaganda because I'm ideologically I'm not reading the writings of Xi Jinping, right? I
Yeah, I haven't read them either.
China announced the eradication this year of extreme poverty in their country.
Mhm.
When I was in DC recently for this conference, you know, it seemed like every 5 blocks there was a camp of, you know, 20 homeless people, right? You know, maybe this isn't super popular on the left these days, but I actually care about the people from my country. I think
Yeah.
that I think that, you know, whatever our difference is, first of all, we're totally inundated with propaganda, so nobody
Mhm.
knows the truth. So they're operating from a starting point that isn't fair to judge them on. One. And two, you know, I think the majority of people from my country are very welcoming people, and I'd like to see the eradication of extreme poverty in the United States. You know, so with that, I'd really like to bridge to our next guest.
Oh.
We're gonna have Caleb Maupin. Caleb recently wrote a book. Hi, Caleb.
Hi, how are you?
Caleb has an great, thank you. Caleb has an excellent book that he just put out. I actually, when I was going to DC and report, there we go, there it is. Buy it on Amazon, right? It's the #1 under anarchism.
It was for a while, yes. It is, yes.
Caleb's an
So,
anarchist now.
could you imagine? Um, so I actually read this book in one sitting. Granted, I was on a plane, so I didn't have much of a choice. But it was a really enthralling, captivating read. I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to take as many notes as I wanted to, so we're gonna give Caleb a lot of space to talk about it. But you know, we talked earlier about these kind of right wing manufactured, the opposite of grassroots, these protests that Mila saw from Falun Gong, from the right wing Cubans, the protests that I was talking about earlier outside the Venezuelan embassy that were trying to help the US government take it over. But one thing that Caleb talks about in his book is was kind of, you know, it's not an idea that you see a lot on left spaces in social media, right? And what he talks about is moving out of the like protest trap, right? And moving towards the masses. So I was wondering if before we get into the actual bread tube part, which we'll explain later, if you could talk about that, Caleb.
Well, sure. I mean, that's a slogan I've raised many times, and the Center for Political Innovation has raised that out of the movement and to the masses. There are millions of Americans, millions and millions of Americans who've never met a socialist or a communist or a leftist or an anti-imperialist, never met one, have no idea why anyone would become such a thing. But much of what the organized left focuses on doing is trying to be king of the protest cage, trying to secure their position, trying to be the big guy at Left Forum. And that is mistaken, because there are millions of Americans now who are hungry, food insecure, according to the Department of Agriculture, without jobs, living in neighborhoods where the roads are crumbling, not with proper drinking water. And now is the time to get to average Americans who are suffering and tell them that the root of their suffering is capitalism, that we have the same enemy that the people of Venezuela and the people of Iran have, the big banks and multinational corporations that are dominating the world and grinding it into deeper poverty, and that we need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need popular power to beat back the power of the rich and the monopolists. And that was the message of the Communist Party when it was very strong during the 1930s. That was the message of the Black Panthers. That was the message of Eugene Debs and the IWW. That's what leftism is about. We need to get out of this notion that left-wing politics is this kind of bohemian, middle-class, intellectual wank, and make it really a working-class populist movement to beat back the power of the rich.
Yeah, so I apologize to my viewers for my bohemian appearance, but my fiance likes it. And once again, shout out to her for the new webcam tonight. I think it's funny that you mentioned that was the message of the IWW, because I would say it's not that today. I think this is you were I thought you would be a great guest, having done this book on BreadTube, which I wasn't actually really familiar. I heard it like once or twice before I read your book. So I didn't really know what it was until I read your book. So if you want to just explain what like BreadTube is.
Sure. Well, after Trump was elected, there suddenly started to be a number of commentators on social media making videos, getting on Twitch and on YouTube and, making commentary on social media, who were calling themselves socialists or leftists and kind of devoted their message to debunking the alt-right and debunking, Jordan Peterson and Richard Spencer and people in that milieu. They immediately went viral, and a lot of them were connected to this video game playing guy called Destiny. I had never heard of it either until I was randomly approached by someone named Caleb Kane and asked to debate this video game playing guy, Destiny. And I had never heard of this person, but I mentioned to a few friends who keep up with the online stuff. I said, I'm going to debate this guy, Destiny, Stephen Bennell, and their jaws dropped and they were like, whoa, Destiny. And I looked, these videos all had like 500,000 views, 2 million views. So I thought, okay, this is a big opportunity. And we had a 2-hour back and forth. And the main thrust of our debate, he was insisting socialism had never been successful anywhere. And I was just reading off economic data, reading off the New York Times statistics, and he couldn't have it. And at one point I reduced Destiny in the debate to saying, quote, what does life expectancy prove? And I said, well, I think it proves an awful lot. And it
Who needs to live for a long time,
Yeah, it was quite a debate. So after that debate, I suddenly got sucked into this world of people like ContraPoints, people like Vosh, people like H Bomber guy, Brewis. It's this whole internet milieu of people who focus on, opposing the Trump movement, opposing QAnon and stuff. But subtly underneath all of that is the message that that somehow Trump is the same as the government of Venezuela, or as the government of Cuba, as the government of Russia, and leftists who don't agree with that, and leftists who oppose regime change wars. We're all secretly crypto neo-Nazis. We're on the right. And
just to interrupt, I've heard that anyone on Rockfin is a secret crypto fascist too. But this is coming out of these people who have been very, very successful on YouTube and made a lot of money from it. But go on, Caleb.
Yeah. So, I thought I didn't particularly like BreadTube, and I debated some other ones. I debated this guy Vosh or whatever, and I had some of them just go after me. I never debated them or anything. Some of them just made videos attacking me. And then a source that will not be named pointed me toward a very interesting piece of information, which is that one of the people who is an advisor to BreadTube, and from what I understand is being paid to give advice to BreadTube, is a guy by the name of Steve Hassan. And Steve Hassan was the leading cult expert in the United States during the 80s and 90s. And his ties to American intelligence are very well known. His mentor is Robert J. Lifton, who was the top U.S. Air Force psychiatrist. He has been on CNN many, many times to give analysis. And he dropped a bombshell after January 6th. He got on CNN and called for mass deprogramming of the country in response to Donald Trump. And if you look into his past, deprogramming has a particularly, interesting meaning because he was a kidnapper, basically, during the 1970s. He was part of something called the Cult Awareness Network that went around kidnapping people who were in Scientology or the Moonies or the Hare Krishnas or some religious group. Parents would pay him and his associates like Ted Patrick money, and he admits that he was involved in what he called, forcible deprogramming, grabbing people off the street, locking them up in the basement and, browbeating them until they change their religious or political beliefs. And that's pretty nefarious. Now, some of his associates even went to prison for it, like Ted Patrick. So this is a pretty shady individual. So he's advising BreadTube. So that kind of gave me the basis for a book. The most of the book is about their ideas, right? I had to explain who BreadTube are in the first chapter, get into some of the bio information about them. They all have some weird, nefarious backgrounds. These are not, people that are in activist groups. These are not people that are going to rallies and protests. These people are, failed comedians. They are, the children of top Hollywood producers. They're not people who just, honestly got into socialism and started a YouTube channel. These are well-produced people that are orienting a generation of younger people that are mad at capitalism and looking for new ideas, orienting them a kind of pro-imperialist and really not even anti-capitalist understanding of what socialism is. And so I spent the book kind of debunking a lot of their key beliefs. And the book has gotten many, many good reviews. Everyone who's ever actually read it, and there's a lot of people who haven't read it who saw a screenshot or something from it and came to their conclusions, but everyone who's actually read it likes it.
Well, I certainly enjoyed it a lot. And I can't emphasize much how much I appreciate your line that it's important to get out of the protest cage and get to the masses, and whether that's in person or online. I have a lot of friends from school who have never been to a protest. Maybe they call themselves socialists or democratic socialists, but the thing is that they've never been to a protest. They do know who Jimmy Dore is, right? Unfortunately, I think that a lot of these BreadTube characters actually do have quite a bit of influence. You're right that they're orienting people towards, imperialism and a very weak kind of anti-capitalism, and I think, as you mentioned in your book, a kind of nihilism too. And they have a lot of influence that way. So it's important to push back on those kinds of things, to promote an anti-imperialist and an anti-capitalist message that actually cares for not just the people of countries that are under the boot of the United States government, but also like other people in our countries. And, these people, like I said, they are getting to the workers because, my friends from school and stuff, they listen to these people while they're working, right? And it helps kind of get them through the day. I don't know if they listen to the BreadTube people. I haven't asked, but I know they listen to Jimmy Dore and so on, on their YouTube app while they're washing dishes or toiling in the kitchen, and it helps, reaffirm their experience. So I think that what you and the Center for Political Innovation, if I'm getting that right, is doing is super important. And I really appreciate that. I don't know, Mila, do you have any questions for Caleb?
Yeah, I mean, so I just, like, out of curiosity, I watched ContraPoint's new video. And, there are parts where, like, I was like, okay, because she talks about Nietzsche, who I really like. So I got kind of excited, and like Huey Newton. But then I got to this part where, she talks about how, oh, well, there's been like 0 utopias from these sort of revolutions. And it really kind of, I felt like it was kind of moving the goalposts a little bit of like what exactly is the aim. And I feel like maybe like they don't really these kinds of people don't really I think a lot of people don't actually see what do we want? Like what do anti-imperialists want? Or what do like American socialists want? And so like how would you respond to that? Especially people who are like hesitant about revolution, right? Because revolution to like the average person seems scary and like violent. I don't think people want that in their streets or whatever. So how do you appeal to people like that without, saying like also being like a contrapoints where it's like, okay, well, nothing, we can't achieve anything and whatever.
There's a couple things I can respond to there. As far as the ContraPoints video, I did watch that latest video, and I thought it was a great example of a rhetorical technique that has been used by the Democratic Socialists of America and by moderate social democrats for decades. They've been using this. And I've named it after Michael Harrington, the founder of Democratic Socialists of America. Yeah, and I call it the Harrington light switch. Because what it is they're 50% right. They point at the left and they say, look, the organized political left, they're ineffective. They're screaming violent revolution. No one's listening to them. They're angry. They're trying to get their anger out. They're not really achieving anything. Therefore, you should be a Democrat. And then that's where they lose. You know what I mean? And it's like you can either be completely irrelevant or you can just be a Democratic Party reformist. And those aren't the only two options. I would say that they're right. The 50%, they're very good. And that video was great at talking about how just kind of getting people to, pour out their anger on people they deem to be privileged, just getting their rage out. That is a very, very bad part. And in this book, I actually talk about that and how, kind of middle class radicalism has kind of a libidinal aspect to it, where instead of striving to make life better for average working people, they're instead striving for some kind of big, orgasmic climax that'll like put the world back into balance with nature, and boom, and everything will blow up and the world will burst into flames. And then, and it's like a Wagner opera. That's how Wagner's opera right? And if you listen to especially a lot of the, like Marilyn Ferguson, who was the spiritual advisor to Al Gore, and she wrote a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy, that's what she's going for. Aleister Crowley, who was the big occultist guru in the 1800s, he also had kind of a similar message. So she was right when she criticized that. But when that particular section you referenced, where she said, oh, there's been zero utopias, and she made it sound like all that ever happened as a result of the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution was people starving and dying and being miserable. She missed the part where millions of people were lifted out of poverty, and millions of people got running water and electricity, and millions of people got access to healthcare, and whole countries went from being agrarian, underdeveloped countries into being global economic superpowers. Russia was the first country in outer space. China now has the second largest economy in the world. A whole hemisphere, practically Eurasia, was transformed by socialism. Cuba has, the highest life expectancy in Latin America, a healthcare system that is the envy of the world. So how can she just look at it and say it was just a big bloodbath of killing and death and destruction? That's just not accurate. Now, as far as, what she's pointing out about and what you're pointing to about how revolution may not be appealing to people. Well, if you look at the great revolutions of history, the way that they are made is by mobilizing people around a program. A program. It's not about what you're against. It's about what you're for. The Bolsheviks were for peace, land, and bread. They were going to end the war. They were going to feed the hungry people. They were going to redistribute land. And on the basis of their program, they built a united front, and they wanted to enact it peacefully, but they were unable to, and they had to defeat the Kornilov reaction, and eventually the Soviets became the government. In China, it was redistributing land to the peasants, defeating the Japanese invaders, and rallying people around their program. And that what socialist groups should be doing more than anything is putting forward a program. Right? The Center for Political Innovation, we've talked about rebuilding the country's infrastructure, having a mass program to rebuild the country, nationalizing natural resources like oil and gas and coal and timber, and having them managed for public good, not for profit. Public control of banking, so the lending of money was strategically done in the interest of the country overall, not for the interest of private bankers, and then enacting an economic bill of rights, securing the right to jobs and housing and education. And those 4 steps, yes, they wouldn't all fully add up to socialism, but in order to enact that program, you would have to beat back so much capitalist power that in order to do that, you would be pushing the working class forward. And that's what revolutionaries tend to do, is they put forward a program, and they don't call for violence. They don't call for destruction. Rather, they mobilize peacefully. And it's, if there's going to be a violent revolution, it's because the capitalists want a violent revolution, because the old order won't allow a peaceful revolution. You know, John F. Kennedy, he said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And that's very true. If you don't let the people organize peacefully to transition towards socialism, if you violently suppress them, there may be a violent revolution. And the great revolutions of history, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, these were acts of self-defense. People had tried to mobilize peacefully. They were prevented from doing so. They were forced to defend themselves, and in doing so, overturn the old order.
Yeah, you know, I think that that idea is really interesting. I like that you talked about infrastructure, right? Because it's a stark contrast to like what I would call the anarchist program, which, you know, has as its key mantra smashy smashy, right? and you know, it's really interesting because we see this same thing in US foreign policy, right? Like if you look at the country that's been responsible for the most development in the last 50 years, it's China. They're building cities, they're building infrastructure, they're building high-speed rail. And the United States is funding in Hong Kong, elsewhere, the kind of people that are more interested in smashy smashy, right? It's the same thing in Syria with the Contras there. It's the same thing across the globe. So I think that's like a really interesting point, is that, you know, socialists, we need to unite on a program of building, not of destroying.
And let me add that, you know, wherever you go in the world, you'll have what you call the revolutionary intelligentsia. And that tends to be a middle class, academic, and usually youthful milieu of younger people that are mad at the old order, reading about revolutionary ideas. And generally, that is where communists kind of started. You know, Mao was one of those, you know, Che Guevara was one of those. But when communist movements have been successful, they've broken out of that and gotten to the masses. But what happened during the Cold War is the CIA figured this out, and they launched a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom that was aimed at kind of, you know, taking that milieu, that revolutionary intelligentsia of intellectuals, and kind of, you know, funding voices in that milieu that would be anti-Soviet, anti-communist, and pushing forward some of the very negative tendencies of that milieu. And that's really how we got to where we are today. I would argue that the revolutionary aesthetics, you know, we're basically at this point have been fully hijacked by imperialism. While, and it's very odd, a lot of times the socialist countries will market themselves in a kind of socially conservative way. You know, China says, look, you know, we're protecting you from all the chaos of Western capitalism. We're raising up the economy. We're offering stability. You go to Nicaragua, the slogan of the government is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. And the socialist countries, what they offer is stability. And that can be kind of conservative when it comes across, because you're offering stability. Whereas the rebellion and, you know, Che Guevara, you know, Guy Fawkes mask aesthetics have been hijacked by imperialism. But, you know, you'll notice, though, that these color revolutions often don't have much support beyond a group of like privileged college kids who spend too much time on social media. You know, I mean, the broad masses of Venezuelan people aren't into that stuff. You know, the broad masses of people in Belarus and in Russia, you know, they don't like what Alexei Navalny or any of these people have to say, because, again, it's only that revolutionary intelligentsia that really is attracted to those aesthetics.
Yeah. And you know, I think that this conversation is kind of, at least in the US, a little bit beating around the bush, because we have these kinds of people in the United States, and they're called Antifa. And, you know, I used to, you know, back in the day, I was, when many of these bread tube people after the 2016 election, when they were getting popular, I was more sympathetic to anarchism and Antifa. And I'm not going to, you know, throw them under the bus either. But, you know, one thing that was kind of a turning point for me, and this is personal anecdote, so I apologize, but I was covering the inauguration, the protests against the inauguration of Donald Trump. I was working for RT at the time. I was live streaming, I was filming, and these people were going throughout the streets of DC chanting, eat the bourgeoisie, that kind of thing, using this very Marxist language, but doing things which were not exactly pro-worker. For example, do I have any sympathy for Starbucks as a company? No. But, I wouldn't want to be working in a Starbucks and have a horde of black-clad protesters come up and start smashing the windows down either. That seems a little bit frightening. Also, a lot of bus stations were destroyed. This is where people go, workers go, because they can't afford Uber or can't afford a car. They go there to take shelter from the rain after and before work, right? Nobody wants to go to work with your clothes all wet. And Antifa was destroying these things. So that was kind of a turning point for me, that really showed me, okay, this is like not the way. These people got it all wrong. Did I 100% think that it was the way? No, of course not. But I had much more sympathy than I do now. And look, I have a lot of sources that are in Antifa, right? And I have had even more. I'm now kind of persona non grata. But these are middle class people. They're college educated. These aren't people who had to who had to forego college to work and support their family. These aren't people who have really been targets of the criminal justice system outside of their protesting, right? They're from middle class neighborhoods, suburbs. They're college educated, and their parents are wealthy. So I just wanted to share that anecdote about how like basic infrastructure that actually exists for workers. One of the few good things that like the government does, these bus stations were destroyed by these anti-capitalist protesters. Like, what's the idea? Oh, if we destroy the bus stations, people will have a general strike. We destroy, we destroy all the bus stations, and there's a mass movement against work.
I'm going to get it in the view there. This guy, George Sorel, now he's an individual that he was a syndicalist, kind of similar to anarchism, close to anarchism, in France in the 1890s and early 1900s. And his main disagreement with the mainstream current of the Marxists was that the Marxists were trying to build a mass party with all kinds of working class people in it, community marching bands and choirs and unemployed associations and seats in parliament and labor unions and such. But Sorel argued that instead you needed to build a small group of fanatical, violent men who will engage in acts of violence that will be inspiring and will kind of capture people's imagination. They'll become heroic. He also argued that mythology and such things were important in motivating people. And he, like, for example, he supported the monarchy, the historical monarchy of France, because he thought like the religious kind of mystical admiration for the monarchy might mobilize the workers. And George Sorel, he was kind of an inspiration to a lot of the anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists in the 19-teens and 20s. But he was also very much a mentor to Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism, the fascisti, the black shirts. They emerged. Mussolini said his greatest inspiration was this guy George Sorel. So it's interesting to think about it. And the main feature of Sorel's teachings was he was a pessimist. He rejected optimism. Marxism is a fundamentally optimistic ideology. It says we're marching from hunter-gatherer civilization to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism. Eventually, we're going to have socialism and communism. Well, Sorel, his belief was a much more pessimistic one. He's also responsible for pushing the idea of the birth strike and arguing that communists and working class people should not have children and that we should drive down the population. And some of these Malthusian ideas, introducing Malthusian pessimism into the Marxist movement. So it's kind of interesting. A lot of the deviations that are pushed forward by the breadtube crowd are not new. They've been around for a long time. They have interesting roots. And that's why, this book is about ideas. It's about ideas mainly, right? When you watch ContraPoints, when you watch Thought Slime, I call him Skippy the Bear, when you watch Jabba the Vosh, you're not hearing new ideas. You're hearing old ideas that, our ideological ancestors have fought against. People like Rosa Luxemburg and William Z. Foster and Gus Hall. They fought against these ideas. So I just wanted to let people know the roots of all of this. It's funny. I got a lot of blowback. A lot of people said, Caleb, why would you write a whole book about internet drama? Well, look at the view count. Look at the view count on ContraPoints. Look at the view count on Vosh or ThoughtSlime. More people are listening to them than are listening to the Revolutionary Communist Party or the Socialist Party or the Socialist Workers Party or the ISO or the QWH or the XYZ. Far more people are listening to these people to get their orientation about socialism than they're listening to any of the tiny little groups out there. So I think if Lenin were alive today, he would probably have written a book about BreadTube. If Marx were alive today and there was some big group, that hundreds of thousands of people were listening to about Marxism, he would have written a book about it. I think there should be more books about BreadTube, honestly. I think that we've kind of dropped the ball. I think that, a lot of times left groups, they focus on action. They focus on maybe appealing to folks in academia. People are listening to BreadTube, and BreadTube serves imperialism. So it's time for us to step up and correct what's wrong, embrace what might be correct, but also correct what's wrong.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you should say. I feel like I was kind of like in the belly of the beast that you're describing. I'm college educated and I'm fairly comfortable I'm all right. And I feel like I was really involved in those radical politics when I was in undergrad and university, and I was kind of really immersed in that. And it was now when I look back at it, I'm kind of like, what did we even achieve? And I mean, on my campus, the really big issue, I went to school in Montreal, and the really big issue was Palestine and Israel. And I grew up with that issue because my family's from the region. So of course I got involved, and it was just people kind of shouting at each other and holding up witty signs. And there were some genuine efforts to get the school to divest from pernicious companies. But something that kind of struck me the other day is I kind of grew out of my radical middle class activism phase for sure. But something struck me during this whole the last news cycle of Palestine and Israel, this person I used to go to school with had this viral tweet, and it was college students were at the forefront of Palestine activism, they're making this happen. And I actually was gonna scream. I couldn't believe what I was reading, and so many people were retweeting it and going off, and this is one person, sure, but this is the peak of what the activism at my school was it was I'm so important, I'm helping this cause that's so far away. And it's no, the people who are sending things to help this cause are the people that you condemn all the time. Even I'm not a huge I don't love Hezbollah or anything, but they are, they're providing material support to the cause, but you never see these people cheering them on because they're not fashionable. And so yeah, that kind of got to me when what you were saying about that, because I think it is really accurate, and I think it continues to be the case.
Well, what's interesting is that Israel-Palestine debate may not be as disconnected from this conversation as you might think. Because Ben Norton revealed that one of the main funders of Jacobin magazine is the
Right.
Jewish Communal Fund, which is an Israeli lobby group. Now, why would an Israeli lobby group be paying for an internet socialist magazine that has run many articles that are very critical of Israel? What's going on there? Well, look into it a little bit deeper. The other thing I've noticed about this BreadTube milieu is that half the time you listen to them, you have to ask yourself, are these people against capitalism, against imperialism, or are they just trying to defend the status quo from this, secret crypto Nazi conspiracy? And that's, if you listen to it, it's ContraPoint's first video that she had that went viral everywhere, How to Spot a Fascist, was all about how there's this vast secret plot of people who've taken over the government, and you can tell by their hand signals and their choices of phrases and their words. And And you listen to this, and this narrative that, like, the government is full of secret Nazis, and there's this big Nazi plot, and all these people are secret anti-Semites. That's actually kind of a Zionist narrative, because that then makes the case that oh my God, there's so much hatred, you would need to then set up Israel. So that's kind of a more liberal Zionist narrative when you think about it, and that is all over BreadTube. And I will add that, Lenin, one of the most important books in the history of Marxism is Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And in that book, Lenin talks about how nowadays it's banks that are the center of imperialism, or the center of the Western economies. And these banks, they funnel money to industries, and they carve out spheres of influence in the developing world, grinding countries into poverty. They set up a global financial system. Well, if you say any of that, immediately the BreadTubers shout, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. No one's racializing this. No one's blaming this on an ethnic group. We're talking about economics. I mean, Lenin's mother was Jewish, I believe. I mean, this is not, but immediately, if you say anything about globalization, if you say anything about NAFTA, if you say anything about economics on a global scale, they shout anti-Semitism at you. And what's weird is they want to just talk about, factory floor analogies, the pencil factory, the hypothetical pencil factory where the workers, their profits are exploited by the employer. So we're going to we're not going to nationalize it. We're going to make it a cooperative pencil factory. And Vosh, in one of his streams, he said that that socialism means everything is exactly the same as it is now, except companies are a worker co-op. Well, tell me, if Boeing was a worker co-op, would that end the military-industrial complex? No. If anything, it would make the workers at Boeing even more enthusiastic about war. What if all the private prisons were worker co-ops owned by the guards? Would that solve the problem? If big pharma were worker cooperatives, and would that solve the opioid crisis? Would there no longer be an incentive to overprescribe addictive medications? Of course not. I mean, the problem with capitalism is profits in command. It is production organized for profit. That's what capitalism is. And even if those profits are shared among employees, which is more egalitarian, it's still production for profit. Socialism is getting rid of the chaos of the market, the anarchy of production, and instead having an economy that is rationally organized to serve public good. And it is that, central planning that has enabled China to grow so rapidly. It was that central planning that enabled the Soviet Union to raise so many people out of poverty. We can be critical of these societies and human rights violations and things that went wrong, but the reason they were able to rapidly grow was because they got rid of the anarchy of production. They got rid of capitalism, production organized for profits. And BreadTube doesn't want to get rid of that. They just want to set up a worker cooperative scheme, which is something that actually many capitalists have proposed throughout history. Many capitalist economists have proposed profit sharing models. There's different names for it. That's not completely foreign to capitalist economics at all, right? Incentive-based pay, worker self-management. These are not foreign ideas to capitalism. So you have to ask yourself, if BreadTube's not even really opposing capitalism, what are they doing?
Yeah, they sound like the Democratic Party, honestly, which is like, it's kind of, how there's some people who like, they want to sell things to like the youth, and so they make it cool. Like there was a joke when I was studying Middle East politics, like ISIS or Al Qaeda is like ISIS for your grandparents, for your jihadi grandparents. And like, I feel like, similarly, it's like BreadTube is like Democratic Party, but for like millennials and Zoomers. And, I had watched like a significant portion of it, and like, I think it's just, like you said, it's everywhere. And so everyone is exposed to it. But that whole thing about, if you say banker, that's like anti-Semitic. I mean, I'm not Jewish, but to me that it seems more anti-Semitic for them to insinuate that like that's the association. And that I feel like I kind of remember that happening with Corbyn as well. And so I really think that this sort of tactic to sell imperialism to people is really like using this new stylish liberal politics where like you can't just disagree with someone. It's like you are a bigot if you do not agree with someone on this issue.
And real politics involves entering real alliances with people and sitting down with people with whom you disagree, finding a common point of unity and organizing around that. Internet debate politics revolves around finding people's flaws in order to prove that you are better than them. in order to discredit them so you win the argument, right? And that's the difference, is that a lot of this is just kind of online posturing. And when it really gets down to it, it's not about actually trying to achieve things. And then again, this is why, the Harrington light switch that, that ContraPoints did in her video is so effective. We can talk about how toxic the online left is, because it is. I mean, we've all seen how toxic it is. People get canceled. Everyone wants to prove they're smarter than everyone else. No one ever admits they're wrong. No one ever goes, "Oh, I was wrong about." No one ever does that. And it's this very, you get into this echo chamber that is even more isolated and more isolated, and you're surrounded by people who agree with you, and you're surrounded by people who even more exclusively agree with you. And yes, there's plenty to criticize there, but the answer is to go to the broad masses of the American people with a program. And that's what Jimmy Dore did with his, the Medicare for All march, right? He said, in his Force the Vote, he said, AOC, bring it to a vote, make Nancy Pelosi put up or shut up, bring it to a vote. And then there was the March for Medicare, the Medicare March. And what did the bread tube crowd say to that Medicare for March? Did they, ContraPoints is on there saying we need to just take action around concrete, proposals? How did bread tube respond to Jimmy Dore and the Medicare for All march? Did they say, good on you, Jimmy Dore, I'm glad you're doing that? Of course not. They boycotted the march. They said it was a crypto fascist march. They baited it. They attacked it. They don't really, at the end of the day, want it. I argue, and I think that BreadTube, we may be not hearing so much out of them now because Biden is well into his first term, and the Trump movement is on the run. They may be reactivated, but I feel like they're starting to demobilize because at this point, the Trump folks have kind of lost and are down for the count. And because of that, if anything, I interpret ContraPoint's latest video as being BreadTube kind of swerving and trying to almost take some of the people it's cultivated into this fight mode into a calm down mode. I mean, when she was defending Marie Antoinette, that was just classic.
I couldn't believe that. I was like, I couldn't believe what I was watching when I saw that. I was not sure. I thought she was like doing a bit for a while.
Yeah.
So if I could real quick, we only have a few minutes left with Caleb. I want to circle back to the Israel-Palestine issue, and I want to kind of bridge that with what Caleb was just saying about making alliances, right? Because as far as progress for the Palestinian people, there's no credit given to the PFLP. There's no credit given to the actual government, representative government of Gaza, Hamas. You may like them or dislike them, but it's really not your opinion that matters. What matters is that they are the actual elected government of the representative government of Gaza. And instead credit is given to, and I as like a Jewish person, I absolutely hate this. Everybody loves to make it about Jews, right? They say, oh, Jewish activism has really allowed the issue of Palestine to enter the mainstream. But there's no credit given to the actual resistance groups. But really quick before we go, we have about 3 minutes. And just trying to keep with the theme of our podcast, question for you, Caleb. Is democracy and socialism, are they incompatible?
Well, no, actually. I would argue that even some of the most authoritarian socialist states have been more democratic than the Western capitalist societies, because the government of North Korea, they don't have the same level of free speech that we have. They don't have the same level of civil liberties or anything. But I can guarantee you, the government of North Korea wouldn't be in power for 1 minute if there wasn't a huge network of people supporting it in every neighborhood, in every community, on every street corner, in every factory, in every farm. And every socialist government depends on a very well mobilized public to back them up on a local level. And when the people are heavily involved in the governing process and heavily involved in mobilizing to carry out the government's program, when the government and the people are almost synonymous, that's very democratic by definition. Democracy just means the rule of the people. And really true total democracy will not be possible until there is the absence of classes. As long as there are different classes in society, as long as there is a division between physical labor and mental labor, as long as there is a division, there's big inequalities in wealth and all that, you're going to have a restriction on democracy. The road to democracy is striving for vast material abundance. As the level of development, technological progress, and abundance develops, inequality can break down. People can become more directly involved in the governing process. And, my belief is that we could eventually get, to an ideal world of a stateless and classless world where even democracy will break down and people can just kind of do what they want and take what they need. That is the ultimate goal of the higher stage of communism, from each according to their own ability to each according to their need. But the road to getting there is having a rationally planned economy where the means of production are organized to serve public good and not profits. That's the road to true democracy. And I think that's the road to the end of state and coercion and poverty and inequality.
Well, thanks so much, Caleb. It's like super enlightening as always when listening to you. You want to tell us where people can check you out?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure. I'm on Twitter, Caleb Maupin. I'm on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel, Caleb Maupin. You can also check out the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. So there you go. And thanks again.
Thanks, Caleb.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm still figuring this out. Thanks again. All right. Well, we have like another guest for you guys. I hope that you aren't dizzy yet. Caleb is one of the most impressive speakers that I know, and always, filled with facts that you're really not going to hear in many other places. I see a lot of you guys have left comments. If you want to keep leaving comments, feel free to. We are going to have a little segment at the end where we'll talk to you guys if you're still around. So we appreciate all the tips so far, and let's bring in our next guest. Mila, do you got anything before we do that?
Oh, just wanted to say Caleb is so, like, I learned so much from him every time. I feel like I'm like, how does someone have so much knowledge on so many things? So yeah, no, always great to talk to Caleb.
Yeah, we'll have him on again, I'm sure. Okay, well, let's bring in our next guest. This is Aidan Jonah. He is the editor-in-chief of Canada Files. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So you've recently done this series about, I guess I would say, like, how narrative is manufactured in Canada. And I'm sure you and Mila will have like a lot to discuss about this because I really don't know anything about Canadian politics. So would you give us a rundown of your what do you focus on?
Right, sure thing. So obviously with the Canada Files, the focus is it's on investigative journalism around Canadian foreign policy from a socialist perspective. That is at the very core of it. That is the work that myself and associate editor Daniel Z, that's the work that we do.
Yeah, and I know, we've been talking a lot about China on this episode, and probably that's going to be a recurring topic here. And I think everybody kind of knows that the United States and China are competitors, right? It could be a friendly alliance where, we work towards the mutual benefit of our people, but it's not. It's the exact opposite. There's, trade war, other forms of economic war, sanctions. For example, there's cultural war. We were talking about worker co-ops earlier. Huawei is a worker co-op, which was obviously banned in the United States to a certain degree. I'm not exactly sure of that degree. And who's one of their company leaders was actually detained in Canada at the request of the U.S. government. So there's cultural war. There's all kinds of different information war, different elements that kind of come together to create this hybrid warfare that's going on. So I'm wondering, like, what role have you found Canada to play in that scenario?
It's interesting. I mean, definitely when people talk about the junior partner kind of role, I think that's a pretty good way to put it, because Canada has never historically led the charge against China, even though it's never really been 100% fully friendly. I mean, I'll take it back a little bit. Right at the beginning of the Cold War, you have the Commonwealth, the whole Commonwealth's Colombo aid plan, basically, it was Canadian Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent basically talked about how that aid plan was specifically designed to try to stop the spread of communism across the region. And so even though Canada obviously probably has had better relations with China over the years, right? It's always still been a fairly insidious, in my view, kind of nasty relationship. And I mean, things were pretty good. Especially after the opening up kind of process. I think Canada's really liberal elite and a lot of the more moderate wing of the conservative elite both viewed China as a country really that could be manipulated into being brought into capitalism. And luckily, and I think they quite frankly couldn't have been more wrong. But I think it's for the best for the world, really. But at that point, right, you have those two countries, of course, being friendly because Canada thinks China is something it isn't. But then it's around 2015, 2016, 2017, right? You've got the Trudeau government coming in, and I'm sure as you're probably well aware of, obviously Freeland really rises to prominence around like the 2017 kind of period. It's around then she becomes the foreign minister. The previous minister actually was relatively friendly, not best buds per se, but they were relatively friendly with counterparts in Russia, and there's decent relations. But once Freeland comes in, things start to deteriorate, and it doesn't really hit off per se until actually it's December 2018. Obviously, when Canada chooses it's the only one out of 33 countries America requested to detain Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. Canada does that on December 1st, 2018, and so that is basically the beginning of, quite frankly, of the death spiral between Canada-China relations. And so as a result, well, not directly as a result, right? But then, of course, you have the two Canadians basically getting arrested pretty soon after. And things have really.
I'm sorry. Could you explain the two Canadians who were arrested? Because I'm actually not personally familiar, and I would.
I had mentioned that earlier too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I wasn't listening so well.
I didn't explain it. I just said they're like on death row.
Right. So I don't think they're on death row. I know there's one Canadian who brought in like a couple hundred kilograms of meth. Basically,
Yeah.
to the country that's on death row.
Okay, I thought you were talking about that guy. Okay.
No. That
well, I think China has a pretty some pretty good reasons to be harsh. I don't believe in the death penalty, but I understand them being harsh towards Westerners importing drugs. You know,
the opium war,
right?
Like it's something that we'll probably get into later, but there's such a lack in the imperial core of how crucial sovereignty is and how traumatic it is for a nation and its people to have that ripped away from them forcibly. So if people take stronger reactions once they regain their sovereignty, I mean, I can't blame them in the slightest. So
yeah, I agree.
So can you tell us about some of the investigations that you've conducted, the relationship between the US and Canada in dealing with, I guess, the strategic enemies, competitors, what have you?
Right. It's interesting in the sense that I mean, I think myself and others have gotten a bit of a feeling in a sense that Canada didn't really desperately want to get dragged into this battle or become one of the leading figures in this battle, but it's kind of felt like to me that the U.S. has kind of slowly coerced Canada into that front, and I think it's a great segue into the investigation that really launched the Canada Files as an investigative outlet. This was back in February, really. So one of the things, obviously, is I'm sure you two are aware of the National Endowment for Democracy. But what you two might maybe be somewhat familiar with if you've read the article, but that investigation actually exposed for the first time that the NED was effectively operating within Canada and hiding this information totally from the public, right? Because they were funding this group called the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project. And I've
talked about like 4 groups already, Uyghur groups that are getting NED money,
Yeah, like how many are there?
When there's regime change to be done and there's money to be made, you better believe people are gonna pop up and take those opportunities.
Yeah, so talk about what this Uyghur group has advocated for. I mean, of course, they're really pushing the narrative that there's a genocide, which has been accepted by the United States government first under Pompeo and then reaffirmed under Anthony Blinken, of course, both of who appeared in my investigation. Has Canada accepted this narrative? Have they officialized it? And what other what kind of things are the NED funding in Canada?
Right. So in terms of the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, it's mainly pushing to have Canada basically actually declare treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang to be a genocide, and really sanctions is the other thing.
Yeah.
Like, of course, these dissident groups abroad always, as you'd know from the reporting and stuff you've done, they tend to advocate sanctions when they kind of act in the interests of a empire abroad. And so there's a whole like story to this, and it's part of the reason why I mentioned the past around Canada-China relations and deterioration of that, right? Is that this all started before this vote happened. It all really started in this International Human Rights Subcommittee. And this thing started about a month before Meng Wanzhou actually was arrested, so October 2018. But this really jumped into focus pretty much in July of 2020, actually. So kind of you can see like that timeline of Meng gets arrested, relations deteriorate, and then you have the subcommittee really actively beginning to push and support this Uyghur genocide, supposed Uyghur genocide narrative, right? And this is where the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project comes in. Of course, its founder is Mehmet Toti. And the reason why I mentioned this guy is because there's this parliamentary Friends of Uyghurs group within the kind of the Canadian Parliament. And so 5 out of the 8 members of Parliament on this subcommittee were in the same parliamentary friendship group as one of the key star witnesses of this subcommittee that eventually led to this genocide report, the so-called genocide report. And of course, like I said, it openly states that it's funded by the NED for its advocacy work in Canada.
Just to, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to put this in short for our viewers,
yeah.
The United States government has adopted this policy that considers the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang to be genocide. And the United States government, through the National Endowment for Democracy, has pushed Canada to also consider the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang to be genocide. So this is like kind of complicated stuff. So I just really wanted to say in brief for our viewers how this is happening, right? But
no
please
worries.
Go on.
Yeah, no worries at all. I appreciate that. And yeah, so the thing that obviously you probably won't be surprised about is people like Ajit Singh, like Max Blumenthal, that played a driving role in debunking this narrative, and quite frankly were inspirations for starting the Canada Files. Basically, they were never invited to this subcommittee. And so obviously I mentioned the fact that basically you have all these MPs and then this star witness on the same basically friendship group. And then this is supposed to be some sort of impartial investigation of this. I mean, that alone should just be enough to drop this entirely. But I don't think we'll have time to go into all this, but there's multiple really of these NED type groups that end up testifying in this subcommittee, and it eventually, including, I'll mention a few because you guys know, well, you two will probably know this: East Turkestan Government in Exile, ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Campaign for Uyghur Human Rights Project, and the one that
and I talked about those earlier, also NED funded groups.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously Max Blumenthal has talked about like the AFL-CIA or CIO as it's more formally known. The CLC is kind of, it's one of the things I want to look into more eventually. Is true is I get the sneaking suspicion that they play a somewhat similar role to the AFL-CIO, even if it's a bit more of a smaller organization, right? But the end game, because this is a hard thing to discuss, and I'm not going to drive people crazy with the details, they can check the article if they want, is that this eventually led to a vote on Opposition Day, where the parliament unanimously voted, other than Trudeau and his Liberal cabinet ministers, to declare the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang to be a genocide. And that included everyone except for, I believe it was 4 NDP MPs who chose to be absent for the vote. So it was it kind of shows how in Canada, really, the imperialism is very much a bipartisan initiative in the mainstream political parties.
Yeah, and going back to the whole thing about pro-democracy protesters, one of these NED funded groups, the World Uyghur Congress, their American offshoot is called the Uyghur American Association. These are people that call for the fall of the Chinese government, and operate a gun club where they train with special forces, near DC. So again, maybe we should nominate them for this week's Democracy Award. Mila, I have another question for Aiden, but if you have anything on this topic, go right ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really important to bring up Freeland in this, her role in this, and just something I want to point out, just because
Victoria, I'm sorry, Victoria Freeland is the foreign minister. Christia. I'm sorry, Victoria Nuland, Christia Freeland. Yes. Okay, go ahead.
But I really, just because I just love to get mad about the mainstream media, I have to say that I think that Canadian media has just been awful on this as well. And there's just, again, this sort of push for Trudeau and for the Liberals to just be all out, not diplomatic with China, to be neocon, more hawks about it. And it's been really annoying to me because, there's all this sort of stuff I can't believe Trudeau didn't say this was a genocide, blah, 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 blah. And it's when did we decide, I know this is kind of a rhetorical question, but, and I had mentioned this earlier to Alex, is if this happened in Canada, if there were 5,000 Canadians that went off to join ISIS and then came back, and I was saying, if Trudeau did not put them in prison, O'Toole and the Conservatives and the National Post and all these media outlets would talk about how they're soft on Islamic terrorism. But because it's not happening in Canada, now it's oh my God, Trudeau is not calling this a genocide based on the evidence of one guy or a cult group. And that's not to say that you can't express concern, because I've said before, I was a critic of the war on terror. If people who are innocent are in prison, that is a cause for concern. But this is a whole show to me. Just being my political enemy doesn't condemn the bad guys, and therefore you should hate them, and therefore you should hate the bad guys. And we see all these media elites in the National Post or whatever Canadian media there is, just being how dare the Canadian left not call this a genocide, or why won't the Canadian left condemn this? And I'm don't tell me to condemn anything on command. I'm not your dog. I just think it's just so revelatory. It just makes me worked up. I just think it's so revelatory that our media elites and our imperialist elites are just salivating at this chance for war with China. They don't even want to try cooperating. They don't want to try any diplomacy at all. And if you are radical enough to believe in any sort of diplomacy, which used to be the sort of adult thing to do, or at least then then you're evil. And again, this is part of this sort of liberal politics thing as well, where it's you can't just disagree with me. If you disagree with me, you're a bigot. You must love genocide. You must love this stuff. Right. It's so funny to me to see these conservative media people who are critique wokeness, and often they're right about that, but then they'll be doing the same thing woke scolds do to you, but about China. It's I can't believe you won't condemn the genocidal fascists, blah, blah, blah. So, right. It's just so, that's my 2 cents on it. It's so ridiculous. I think Canadian media is a massive overhaul.
And to kind of circle back to some of the issues that we were talking about earlier with Israel Palestine with our previous guest. I mean, people say, oh, well, Tulsi Gabbard's a fascist because she met with Bashar al-Assad, right? Anyone who has ever said anything short of he must go is a fascist because of how they have treated
How dare
Bashar
she be
al-Assad.
diplomatic? Yeah.
And then the PFLP from Gaza, the communist group there, they go and they meet with Assad. So I mean, by the left's logic, the Palestinian Communist Party is white supremacist genocide deniers. So I think that's just really important to point out. But one thing, and both of you can kind of consider this more of a prompt than a question, because I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this. When I did some reporting in Honduras, and I've written a lot about the United States government's role in Honduras, because this is totally a failed state. The government is run by basically a drug cartel. I mean, I'm not exaggerating here. The president's brother is in prison in the United States for dealing drugs, and the president himself is listed as a unindicted co-conspirator in that indictment of his brother for taking drug money for his political campaign. The United States played a big role in supporting that coup in 2009 under the Obama administration, right? But when I went to Honduras, a lot of people were telling me that Canada also played a big role. Why? Because of Canadian mining interests. So, I've written a lot about the U.S. role in that coup, the U.S. role in the region, but I'm wondering about the role of Canadian mining companies. And either of you can feel free to jump in, because I feel like this is an underexplored topic that would be useful for people to know about.
Right, for sure. I think obviously around the democracy promotion and certain initiatives, that was more the U.S.'s forte per se. Though CETA's aid projects and are very much an aspect that I'm myself and others at the Canada Fellows are very much intending to dig into more as time goes on, because I'm very, very suspicious of the aid agencies, given the history of some of the actions that's been taken. Obviously, mining interests really do draw on Canada's foreign policy, whether it be in Latin America or in African countries that have the mineral resources. But it's one of those things that's interesting when you look at the case. Obviously, I believe it was Manuel Zelaya, I think it was.
Manuel Zelaya, the president
right.
of Honduras before the coup. He was left leaning. He wasn't socialist, but he was left leaning.
He was actually, the sense I always got, he struck me. I mean, as a liberal type, right? But the interesting thing with him was he was a liberal that responded to social movements. And part of the reason why I worry so much about the influence of the NED, of these kind of foreign institutions from abroad funding these groups, secretly, in fact, is because if the liberals ever grow enough of a backbone to go against these positions, quite frankly, I do worry for Canada's sovereignty at the end of the day. If these quote unquote pro-democracy and these quote unquote these dissident groups are allowed to kind of fester, build up, get support from these questionable groups, where does that leave the future of Canadian sovereignty? I think it's a danger that I don't think is being considered enough, because I mean the NED also, and this is what I exposed in my recent piece, they also fund a second group, the Centre for Law and Democracy in Canada, and then you have Open Society, which is of course the foundation of billionaire George Soros, secretly funding 3 Canadian liberal NGOs in this country through a pass-through organization effectively called Impact, that used to be basically a CETA disbursement fund organization. So you have these kind of organizations funding these groups in Canada that may not be malicious now and may not be going against the state now. But if these groups aren't addressed early, then that leaves Canadians in a really big problem, because quite frankly, for how horrible the Canadian state is, for goodness sakes, I do not want America basically subverting America or Europe subverting our politics. Canadian foreign policy should be decided by Canadian people, and it's severely under threat. And I don't think a lot of people get how it is. And quite frankly, I think that's because there's been a total failure of investigative journalism in this country on an institutional level. Like with the Canada Files, I started this when I was 18, 1 month into journalism school. Basically, I'm proud of the work that myself and Daniel Z have been able to do. But for goodness sakes, if there's a serious left in this country, I would have never been in the position where I would have felt the need to go and start this. And this is part of the reason, like, why I'm willing to run through a wall for this kind of work, because for goodness sakes, like the very sovereignty, foreign policy, these things are really at stake. We are in such a transitory time, and then, quite frankly, you just have people not taking foreign policy seriously, or you have people just focused more on, like, of course, cancel culture and a lot of these really pointless, meaningless bickering. I mean, like people like BreadTube and these kind of things. I'm really glad Callum, for example, is really strongly against them. But I always find I don't even wade too much into that stuff, because there's just so much serious investigations to go and do. There's so much to expose. And so I don't know. I sure, it's definitely not an imminent threat. But look, if the Liberal government if their social movements ever grew strong enough in Canada, and there's a continued tolerance of NED, of Open Society, of these other groups basically being funded within Canada, it's not a good situation, and it's very urgent in my mind. I just see the fate of states that basically weren't able to fight off these pro-democracy or dissident groups funded from abroad, and the fate that they hit. And of course, maybe it's not the most imminent thing, but look, I think it's something people need to consider. It's a real problem, and I don't think myself or Mila or any other people in Canada really want American democracy. I mean, even Canadian democracy sucks, but somehow American democracy is worse.
I do want to. I'd prefer to live here for sure. No, but I do think that okay, no hate. I like California a lot, but I just mean I like having healthcare. But I really like, I was thinking about this the other day, and like this is gonna be a bit on like a lighter, funny note, but also like, when the US like it tries to meddle in other countries, they always have like a human rights cause. And I'm like thinking, well, what if they want to like annex us for water at some point? What cause are they going to embrace? And I'm thinking, like, how they embrace like Uyghur separatism. So like maybe they'll do that with Quebecois separatism. They'll start waving like the Quebecois flag. I think that would be really funny.
Think Calgary. I think Alberta separatism that kind of Wexit separatism could easily be molded into that, and they would happily take that money.
Yeah, they would. Whereas Quebec, maybe not.
Yeah, and obviously there's the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, and these kind of historical groups that the United States has funded to position against the government. But this has actually been like a really common occurrence in Latin America, because part of the failure of some of these left-leaning governments, not all of them, in Latin America, has been to reach indigenous communities, to give them access to society at large. There's infrastructure issues, there's job issues, and so in Honduras, in Peru, and I'm sure all across the region, the United States has used indigenous people to advance its imperial agenda. Giving activists their money, not giving money for them to build the infrastructure that they actually need, but giving the activists, the ones that are like kind of hell-bent on regime change, money, training, that kind of thing, to then go wage that proxy war against the government. So, I mean, if we were going to go after Canada, that might be a route. But we only have a few minutes left with Aiden. Do you want to tell us, just more about your website, where people can find you? Anything else you want to say about yourself or your investigations or whatever?
Yeah, sure thing. So after about 20 months of really hard critical investigations and really building a track record of these investigations, the Canada Files launched a fundraising campaign. And so really the key thing is that the Canada Files just needs to take the next steps. Canada needs a serious basically anti-imperialist investigative institution that is really dedicating to digging into Canada's foreign policy. Because look, that is a full-time thing. That really is a full-time thing. And the biggest thing about this campaign, right, is the simple goal is just to get myself and Daniel to be able to do this as a minimum wage job. Basically, it's not an ambitious task per se. It's simply to get work as a minimum wage job. And the key thing is, right, the incentive we're offering, I'm sure you're aware of Aaron Monte's pushback show. That's something where I'm offering up is I will start a Canadian equivalent of that, covering foreign policy, the most recent events impacted by Canada's foreign policy. And so that's the kind of the innovative journalism that the Canada Files does. And it's one of those things where myself, Daniel, the Canada Files, we don't hesitate to take the risks to cover imperialism, to take the brunt of the attacks. It's nothing we have no issue with, but we just need to be supported in that. That is the really big thing. So if you go on the Canada Files site, you'll be able to see a donate bar. Click on that, and you'll get there. In terms of seeing more of the work, if you want to follow me on Facebook or Twitter, it's just Aiden _Jonah, and on Twitter it's the _Canada_files. So certainly, I think there's some more things around American interference and such that I think might be good to discuss on here. But the fact is, I'm really, really grateful to have had the chance to discuss this with you two. I really hope eventually that Canada can build up that kind of media ecosphere on the podcast and video front, because that's one of the most interesting things I've figured as I go through the fundraising process and take on some of these aims, is realizing that institute is something that I've known all along. Institutions, building those institutions is one of the most crucial things. Canada, just like America, has space for multiple anti-imperialist critical investigations. You look at America with the Gray Zone, Mint Press, Black Agenda Report, so many others. That is the kind of media ecosphere that myself and Daniel are trying to work to build. Obviously, there's imperfections. Look, I acknowledge that. No doubt.
Oh, I just wouldn't say so many, but yeah.
Well, there's some at least.
Yeah.
There's at least an inkling of an ecosystem, and that's desperately what Canada needs.
There's a huge
Canada
audience.
doesn't even have one institution, right? And that's what the Canada Files is trying to build.
Great. Well, more power to you, Aiden. I look forward to seeing more come out from your website, and I really thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Absolutely. And I wish you two good luck in this initiative.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, that's very refreshing, because Canadian media is horrendous. So
Yeah.
we need it. I encourage people to support the Canada Files. I really think, our media landscape in a lot of ways is worse than the US, and like most of our mainstream media is owned by one company. It's not good. It's not a good time.
Well, this show's gonna break that. We're gonna break. I'm sure of it. So we're winding down here. We were hoping to have actually Max Blumenthal, editor of the Gray Zone, on for a little bit, but it's not looking like he's going to be able to make it. Some things came up, so unfortunately, we'll have to save Max for a future episode. But I'd like to take a quick look through some of the comments. I don't know if you have them open. I can read them. Turbo GG says it's knee-jerk anti-authoritarianism, and the imperialists know how to manipulate it. I think that was in the intro to our podcast, talking about the pro-democracy protesters. Ben Norton, you guys should all know who Ben Norton is. He's really like one of the best there is. I admire him so much. He says, cool to see this new show. Congrats, Alex and Mila. I look forward to seeing more. That's really nice of him. Mooney says hi. Turbo GG back again says it's Ben Norton. Cool. Mooney wants to know if I'm from the UK, or neither of us are from the UK. Is this channel about UK issues or USA issues? Look, Mooney, this is about global issues here. But I appreciate your question. Welcome to Rockfin from Scott Augustine. Alex and Mila on Rockfin. This is awesome. That's from Jenny. Matt says, agreed, Jen. 31st Century Socialism says, hey, it's Caleb. Jenny says, agreed, two-party illusion. And then, hey, handsome Matt. I have a Matt we can use tonight. That's from Jenny. I don't know if that's for the chat, Jenny, but
You know what?
good
Lay it
luck to
all
you.
out. Express
Did Caleb
yourself.
just say intellectual wank? I don't know. Did you hear him say that? I mean,
I can't remember now.
Caleb's filled with quips. I mean, that guy's like,
he's good.
he's really
He's
quick.
good.
31st century socialism, love it. We got some tips. Thank you guys who tipped.
Thank you.
We
Nice.
appreciate it. Canadian corporate, this is from Ben Redward. Canadian corporate media covers genocide in China as if it's established fact, despite the absence of evidence. Absolutely true. You know, I would encourage people to, you know, I've been writing a lot over the past week or two about, you know, what's going on in Xinjiang, but I haven't debunked it because, you know, it's already been debunked. The Gray Zone has done that. So I kind of just focused on the U.S. side and the network of activists, NGOs, evangelical groups, etc., and U.S. government officials that are pushing that. So yeah, again, check out the Gray Zone if you want to read more about read more of the debunking of that issue. And then Ben Redward says that parliamentary vote was a total disgrace. Which one was that, Mila? Do you know?
The one condemning China for genocide. Yeah.
And then yeah, that's it. Ben Richards says just got an e-transfer from my master's in Beijing. LOL. Well, thanks for the tip, Ben.
Thank you.
Again, everyone, thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure. We're super excited about Rockfin. I mean, I think that, you know, recently I believe that I was censored by a mainstream outlet in the United States. They gave me a contract. They killed my article, and then they canceled my contract. So Rockfin would never do that. I really want to thank the folks at Rockfin for giving us this opportunity. And, you know, I think Caleb was a great guest to have to talk about the YouTube left ecosystem, the podcast ecosystem there, and how that's so corrupt. So we're like really thankful to Rockfin for having us on their platform. I think that's going to be it for the night. Mila, do you got anything else?
Yeah, just thanks so much again, everyone. This is really great, and I'm really grateful for all the support.
Great. Have a good night, everybody.